Okay, I think that I'm going here. We'll see in just a few seconds. Assuming that we are, welcome to Composition Masterclass number 12. I have to be honest, I kind of don't like doing these a whole lot. And it's not that I don't like looking at pieces and things like that. But I'll tell you why. Ever since I really started doing private lessons, which I have a small studio of private students now, private composition students, there's a great back and forth. And that's just not something you get in this arrangement. I can really get into the weeds a lot more in a one-on-one lesson versus just looking at these pieces. And here, honestly, a lot of the time I feel like I'm just saying, oh, fix this engraving thing, fix that engraving thing. And I'm not really getting into the meat on the bones, if you will. So that's been something that I've thought about, and I have put off doing this masterclass for a little while, in part also because I am extremely busy, or I was at least extremely busy in the month of November. And it was always good that I'm no longer holding myself to this like strong schedule of like I will produce one video per week, which is just really, even if I had nothing else on my plate, considering the amount of effort that's going in each and every video now, it is really not particularly reasonable. So first we have a piece here by Paul Bibal. Once again, my pronunciation fails me. And he writes, my name is Paul, and I'm a 17-year-old amateur composer from the Philippines. I've been composing for a few years now, and I'm largely self-taught with regards to composition and theory. The piece I'm sending in is the first movement of piano quintet that I wrote some time ago. It was one of my first works written in a more modernist style, as opposed to the neo-romanticism I'm more familiar with. If you have any criticisms over the engraving, admittedly I rushed cleaning the score on this one, notation, general compositional aspects, or literally anything else, please let me know. I would love to improve my music going forward. So that being said, let's take a listen to a MIDI rendition of this piece. Nice interplay between the bassoon and the horn here. Not quite sure of how you get back. That really works super well. It's a very dramatic thing in the piano. I would consider doing octaves here. It's very different, contrasting material here. Pretty low for the flute. I do really appreciate the polytonality here. Very mid-20th century sound. It's not atonal, but it's not strongly tonal either. I like the motivic development here. You're contrasting the horn with the winds really quite nicely. Some neat texture. We'll see more articulation markings on the piano. Nice use of the flutter tongue there. I'm really liking this so far. Nice shape to that whole section there. We could have it quite nicely with the return to these sorts of fifths and fourths. Should fix this. I want to hear more of this sonority. What there to explore. Oh, here it comes. There you go. Kind of Copeland-esque. Ivesian. We have an arch form going here. Referential sonority from the beginning. It's starting to make more sense now. Just some more interesting with these trills here. Change register, I think. I think this is moderato con fuoco. This isn't something that's with fire. It's nice, it's just not accurate tempo marking. Move the Misterioso up. This will get in the way of the flute here. I'm really digging the spacing here as well. Each instrument really does have their own character. They're paired off in different ways, which is quite nice. That movement's quite... I keep saying things I like. That's cute. That's cute. There's a lot of stuff to like about this little piece. Let me stop moving the source here. A little OBS terminology on you. This glitchy little streaming software. Yeah, what I really like about this sort of sound is that when it first comes in, like I hadn't really looked over this piece at all, and I wanted to hear that come back a little bit more often. I use the term referential sonority quite a bit. And that, in non-tonal music, this basically refers to chords that you hear often enough that they sound like home, like you would for say, the tonic triad of a tonal piece. There's a kind of home that you find in that one chord or pitch collection, or if you're using set theory terminology, simultaneity, in order to establish a sense of home that you then can return to. Because that's the whole point of having a tonal hierarchy as well, is that you have a home that you establish in terms of a key center, and then you move away from that, then you move back to it. And that's the dramatic motion. And that tension and release is something that is really quite also pursuable in other slightly less tonal forms of music, such as this one. You definitely use tonal centers. It doesn't seem like it's particularly in one key for a very long time. But this is quite a mature piece in terms of a lot of the orchestration is actually quite nice. I love how you use the upper range of the bassoon here. You're generally quite good about making sure that the flute can be heard. There are a couple of instances I think I pointed out along the way where it sounds might be a little bit sketchy, but nothing that's not overcomable in the performance. This stuff here, I liked it, and it doesn't really come back in a way that I think is audible or works. I'd have to sit with the piece a little bit longer to see, and I liked how it fit, but you do return to a lot of other stuff as the piece goes along. It's almost like an arch form, it sounds like to me. And this polytonal stuff is actually really interesting. And I just want to hear more of it. And I think you could maybe find a way to plug this in somewhere else. But I really do like how you move in and out of these different sections. Each section seems like it has its chance to shine, and a really, really good chance to breathe as well, which is always supremely, supremely important. Pull out my notes so I can load up the next piece. My computer is really complaining about this. Okay, into the next movement. Not next movement. I'm running a huge piece of a bunch of movements, so I'm used to saying next movement. All right. Let's get this loaded up here. All right, this is a piece by Ryan Giraldi, who writes, "Hello, Mr. Little. So formal. I've recently submitted my pre-screening materials to several conservatories, and I wanted to submit my principal one, written for organ. Excuse the pun. Ha! Principal. It's an organ joke. For future masterclass, just to receive a second opinion. My organ teacher was only able to give his general approval of the piece, so I'd really like to have some other ears give it a more in-depth analysis. I'm not sure this is an analysis, but I will give you some thoughts. I should have also probably explained that the diamond-shaped note heads are meant to indicate the notes are to be played on a separate manual by the same hand. Parentheses indicate that the intermanual playing is optional." Yeah, so there's no preliminary note to this piece. It's just the Lament. And we will see those optional intermanual playing bits down here. Before we even get started on this, listening to it, I really think that there's a better way to notate this. It's basically just on one voice. It's this alto line here. You're stimming it in. That's the only place where it comes in. It's very consistently stemmed. I understand where you're coming from in wanting to make a simpler notation for this, especially clearly coming from an organ background, but I would just go with a more standard notation. Really, there's no reason to try to invent something new here when you can be much more particular on the registrations as well if you say, well, this is supposed to be great and swell, which on two manual organs, that's the only thing you're going to be guaranteed to have. There's not really anything in the way of of registrations in this, which I suppose is up to you. I mean, as an actual organ player, that would be more of a thing that you would be an expert in, I suppose. I've heard different things, not being an organist, just being a guy who has played the organ in the past. I've written one major organ piece. I'm almost about to write another one, another commission, which is kind of cool. It's not about me, this is about the piece. Where was I going with this? That's why I prefer to have an actual lesson, because I can actually talk to someone and they can tell me what I was talking about. Yes, registrations. Organists, I think, typically when they're writing their own stuff, will put a registration in there, at least a basic one. And even if those particular stops are not available on an organ, you will at least be given an idea of what the sound and the timbre are supposed to be. So I would, if you have that intimate knowledge of the organ, I would do at least a little bit of addition of registrations in here. But again, I am no expert. Let's take a listen. I'm trying to play it. There it is. This is not what's notated. C coda. Right, I'm so confused. Oh, it's a beginning cadenza. There's gotta be a better way to notate that. Standard practice is to put a rest here, come out over all of it, and just say cadenza. Seems much more French organ school than German, in terms of some of the voice leading here. Oof. Oof. Ah. I'm not sure shuffling is the right word here. Don't be doing this. This will be a playback thing. No, please don't. Senza rigore. This is so French, just use some French. Go all in. Rhythmic notation here, not good. Yeah. Make it two voices here. One of the moves can have that rhythm, and the other one's just a half note. I want to hear more pauses in here. A lot of continuous notes. I think repeating this a couple of times with some breaks in between it could be kind of cool, developing it slightly every time. This is juicy. I know you're in flats, but this makes more sense to be a sharp. Everything else is sharp in this measure anyway. Rhythmic notation. Yikes, also been notation here. Ooh. Really nice chord progression. Yeah, rhythmic notation here is just, don't put that long a note on that off of a beat. I really like the chords. I really like the harmonic language here. It's very late Romantic, early 20th century French. See, I like how the way that it starts. I think you could be a lot clearer with the fact that there is an ad libitum intro, perhaps just a longer opening measure with a whole rest. Then maybe you could like just know the measure really, and this can be a pickup measure still. But what you would have to do is indicate that it's a cadenza, as opposed to just ad lib. And then the coda, do you want it to be inspired by the coda? It seems like that's what your goal is that the coda will provide the inspiration for the introduction, which is improvised every time. It's an interesting formal device that you're pursuing there, and I think it's worth pursuing that. What it might be a little bit easier for the performer. Of course, a lot of organists are more trained in improvisation than other performers are in other instruments nowadays. Just like even formally within the conservatory training, like improvisation is an integral part of, especially being a church musician. You know, you got to noodle around during communion in non-plague times, obviously. So I think that's something to consider is giving some kind of guide to how long the introduction should be. At the very least, making sure that if you have an organist who maybe isn't super familiar with the piece itself, or kind of what you're going for harmonically by the end, just giving a few maybe chords or sonorities here and say, improvise based on some of these harmonies, some of these rhythmic gestures, things like that. A fire alarm is going off. Not in my apartment, I don't think. It could be, though. I'll ask my roommate when I'm done with this. I told him specifically, don't let the fire alarm go off. It's an extremely sensitive fire alarm. It's just a hair trigger. Anyway, I'm questioning this. You need a double bar line anyway. I don't hear the shuffling bit about this. Maybe that is something that we can that can be improved a little bit. Ethereal, I like that, but these aren't really tempo markings. They're more expressive markings. So I would, if you're really, really dead set on shuffling and ethereal, I think ethereal makes more sense than shuffling. I would italicize them, not bold them. I'd put them, somewhere next to the dynamic markings, because they're expressive markings. They're not tempo markings. Expression can be a part of a tempo marking, but by itself, you're not really changing the tempo there, or are you? You might be. Change the tempo, I would actually put a tempo marking here, which you at least put a metronome marking here. What I was always told is that you need to include an actual tempo marking, like the speed. You should have some descriptive markings, like instead of just allegro agitato. That gives you a lot more information. Like if you're really dead set on using Italian, which I like to do. And then beyond that, you also do need some kind of metronome marking, or at least vague metronome marking. Range, I like to use squiggly lines, like an about equals sign, because I don't want people to play my music a lot of times too metrically or rigidly. So that's something to consider here. Fermatas go all the way through, not just on one voice, but all the voices that are active at one time. And when this material comes back here, I want something different. This is just a straight up recapitulation. It sounds like to me. There's this crescendo, and you add some stuff through here to get to the forte, this climax at this point, although there's also another climax here. I mean, there's so much more you can do solely with like the registrations that would make it sound different. But I think you could do something more with especially the middle voice. This kind of stuff, one of my old professors called marking time. You're really not doing a whole lot by just repeating the same chords, and that is part of the style. It's part of Franck, Fedor, Vierne, that sort of school of organ playing. You have those kinds of things. I just think there's something a lot more interesting you could do in the middle voice there. And now this counterpoint is really quite nice. I'm going to go even further than that. I think it's quite good. And furthermore, I think it is indispensable to the piece. I don't think you should make this thing optional. I would rather an organist have to play that on one manual if they don't have access to another manual. I'd rather them play that on one manual than not play it at all. Mostly because it is really cool to have that kind of counter melody, which is a little more angular. Like you have these leaps, this leap down, this leap up, whereas, you do have those kinds of leaps in the melody itself, but rhythmically it seems a little more uneven and more jagged, which is really quite cool. It reminds me of the counter melody that comes in at the end of it's a very, very early C-sharp minor etude by Scriabin. He was about 15 years old, and it's really gorgeous. It's like I couldn't have written that at 15. I was writing the theme of the Classical Nerd channel at 15. I didn't realize it was going to be that at the time, but there's a really, really, really nice moment where there's this counter melody in the middle voice, like this tenor line played with a left hand. And it is also indispensable to the piece. And this reminds me of that because it is a recapitulation. You're adding something on top of that recapitulation. I would not get rid of that. Towards the end, the rhythmic notation becomes really quite bad. Like, I don't want to be mean. Here, there's two voices going on. You're not filling out the entire measure with those voices. You need some rests down here to show what's going on. Here, you don't put a quarter note on a 16th subdivision. You would make that 16th tied to a quarter, then tied to another quarter, then tied to a dotted 16th. If you really wanted that break here, or 16th tied to a quarter, tied to a half, and then instead of this rest here, which seems kind of odd, just put a little breath marking, and if you really want that longer, you put a little fermata over the breath, and you're golden brown delicious, as they say. I don't really say that. I just say it sometimes, and it sounds weird whenever I do, and I keep telling myself I'm not going to keep saying it, but I still do. It's one of those faux Southernisms. And then the coda, same problem here, basically. I would just flip these note values around. But this is really quite nice work. Moving on to our last piece of the day. Yep. This does not have a recording associated with it, but it's a trio for clarinet, cello, and piano, first movement, by someone named Scipio. I have a full name for this person, but this is from the email that they sent me, but I only use what's printed on the score here. So this person writes in, I enjoy your channel. I saw your video where you critiqued a nocturne and a scherzo from a viewer. Wow, that's a deep cut. It's like the first one I did. I was wondering if you had the time to do the same for me. I composed the following piece a while back. Now, we don't have a recording for this. I didn't feel like doing a mock-up of this. So we're just going to look through this old school, and this is more of how a standard composition lesson goes. Yeah. First off, big issue here with the score. Bar line should not go all the way through. Grand piano, that should be a grand staff, and there should be a lot more spacing here. No dynamic markings to speak of. This kind of writing works for the clarinet, I think. I don't know what is going on here. That is, I'm sure that's probably achievable using some kind of harmonic. Let me change the text below. Yes, we're looking at this piece now. I keep forgetting to do that. There's so many different screens that I'm going around, many of which are just out of view for all of you. Yeah, I've talked a lot about these issues before. I really don't like going back over and over engraving issues, but it is worth saying that pedal markings, first of all, this is a really archaic type of pedal marking, and technically I think that means you're supposed to restrike the pedal or lift it up, depending on the context. And it should not go in the middle of the staff. No. I'll get to some of the questions here just after this piece, because this is the last one we're doing. But I noticed that someone has commented, the clarinet is not transposed. Yeah, I'm not really critiquing that because, honestly, it makes it easier for me. And it's also it's a practical concern that you have to have it transposed when someone's playing it, but a lot of the times scores today, full scores, are going to be in C. Fifths like this are not easy to pull off on the cello. I avoided them for the longest time. I'm sort of more willing to do them now. I think you have to know your string players. Like if you have an amateur string player, that's going to be kind of wobbly and out of tune, especially if you're coming from a high note right before it at a relatively quick tempo. Let's see, allegro appassionata ma non troppo. All right. I'm not sure that's how you spell appassionata, but I'm not gonna go into that. Where was that funky bit of nonsense? Yeah, here. If you think about it, like you're going from a high B flat to having to play those. Right, so this B flat, you can play this on pretty much any string. It'd be very difficult to play on the C string, but you can get basically 2 octaves out of one string. That's my rule of thumb. You would probably play that on maybe the A string. A string would be the easiest. But then think about it, you'd have to either finger the notes like that and make sure they're even and in tune, because if the fifth is slightly out of tune, you're really going to hear it because it's supposed to be this really perfect and pure interval. So you have to really bar it across there, or you would have to do something with, I wouldn't know exactly what fingers they'd use, but you have to finger with 2 fingers in a really, I think, unusual or odd position. So I think you can pull it off if there's more space, if you have a whole measure or even like one or two beats at the very least to get into that position. But going from here to there, I'm not sure what you're really going to get out of that. Especially here because you're going to go to the B flat right after that anyway. Just have this as an E flat. Here, I'm not as... This might be okay. I think this would definitely depend on the size of your cellist's hand, if they can pull this off or not. There's a lot of acrobatics in the cello. There seems to be a lot of activity in the cello, considering that it is much more accompanimental here. It does not seem like the cello is really coming to the forefront here. If nothing else, just in terms of register, I think you can beef that up and go a little bit higher. Especially if the piano is doing these big, thick chords, you don't want the piano to get in the way. So that is something to consider through here. This is going to be a neat sound. By neat, I mean you may or may not like it. There's a reason that a lot of composers for many years avoided parallel fifths, because they sound like that. And if you like it, then great. If not, then there'll be something a little more interesting you can do figuration-wise there, because there's just a lot of eighth notes that are churning along here. Got some 16th notes here, which is neat. The fingering on this might be interesting, but it's not, impossible to do. I like the fact that you're finally giving these instruments a break here, and going from this kind of bigger texture, this big full chord here, to just one solitary line. I'd make that longer, right? You seem to be contrasting this, and then at moments of repose, you have this flourish in the piano. I don't think that this is a great figuration. I think you can get the same effect using something that's a little bit easier to finger, especially because this is just an open chord here. And if you really want that kind of open sound, there's so many ways you can just use G's and D's in a much more florid way that you can use both hands on, which is so much easier than bum 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 bum. Ooh, I almost knocked off my water. Sorry. All right. What else do we have here? If you have the pedal down, this is naturally going to ring out. You don't need the sort of let it carry on notation. This would be if, for instance, I don't know, if you were plucking a note on the cello, pizzicato, and wanted that to ring out as opposed to being damped, you would use that, or it's often used in harp notation to say basically, don't damp this if there's a vibrating string. You don't need crescendo and diminuendo. You don't need crescendo and diminuendo markings and hairpins at the same time. Definitely invest in some clef changes here and some 8th VA markings here. I want to hear more cello by itself, actually. Maybe dovetail the clarinet line into the cello. The clarinet can go down quite low, and might be interesting to have the clarinet lower than the cello. You could very easily do that. Or dovetail them so that the clarinet comes down, cello comes up to meet it, you have the unison for a while, and then they'll be in tight harmony where the clarinet's above and the cello's below, they meet, and then the cello then splits up off. That could be an interesting way to continue that melody. It's reminds me of that Schulhoff piece that people post as memes and guess the score Facebook groups. Oh, I see what you're doing here. You can just use that as that's one voice, and then cross the beams over. That'll be interesting, depending on your tempo. You do use a clef change here. Very good. Use more of them. You have a little intimations of polyrhythms here. This 4 against 7, 2 against 7, like these are not going to quite line up. But this is just going to sound like this big falling cascade of notes. Oof, all these octaves. Violinists will usually complain about octaves, but they're often called to do them in really difficult solo rep. The cello is a much bigger instrument, so asking for that kind of stretch is, I don't think you're going to get anything out of it. I would just stick to something that's higher up, and again, just push it higher. You don't need to stick to just basically the bass clef staff. It's kind of a hand-in exercise texture here. This seems like it's going into this kind of fugal territory. You don't need, that's a copy and paste error right there. Rhythmically, it does seem quite square. And this, okay, we have a bit of a recapitulation here. Rhythmically, it's quite square except for these little flourishes. And I like the fact that these septuplets have their origins in that middle section in the florid piano. I think this is a good way of taking that kind of virtuosic texture and making it more part of the piece as opposed to just, here's some piano fireworks for the sake of piano fireworks. There are more fire alarms going off. What is going on? These trills would be interesting. I'm wondering if, again, you just have the piano going on so often here. Maybe have the piano drop out. You could also call for the cello to do something, maybe tremolo and perhaps ponticello as well. It'd be a really neat color. And maybe the piano does something, but it's not whatever this is. This fifth texture. This is a very subtle change of tempo here. I'd make that much more clear. This is good. This is the kind of upper register cello range I was talking about. Use tenor clef or even treble clef if you absolutely need it. And don't use the clarinet here. You're just doubling something in the piano. The piano has a lot of color in it. You can let instruments stand on their own. All right. Usually at this point, when we get to the end of the piece, I can go back over it and talk about it, but I already talked about it. So those are the three pieces. Now I'm going to hop into, look back at the chat, and we'll see the outstanding questions. Aiden Daniels, favorite violin concerto? Alban Berg. I keep saying it. There's some other good violin concerti out there, and I don't fault anyone who doesn't have Berg as their favorite. I've joked about it. To me, it's just, it's the pinnacle of what composition can do from so many different angles, for the amount of thought and effort and just different things that went into it, and it works. Like it's everything in the kitchen sink. You mentioned the organ lament was juicy. I realize it was an informal comment. What does that imply? That's something that my friend Tyson and I use a lot. Spicy and juicy are two different things. That spiciness is like very dry, punchy, staccato texture. Think more like Milton Babbitt serial kind of music. That's more spicy. And then juicy is like you have nice harmonies, extended chords, really neat chord progressions, which is a little more applicable to music of the late Romantic and into the 20th century. What's the queue for scores at the moment? People just send me stuff, and if you would like to send an in-progress piece, you can. Keep in mind, I only ever cover one piece per composer for Masterclass, and if you want extra help, commentary, then that would be in the form of private lessons, which you can set up. Juicy means spicy harmony. Yeah, spice and juice are related concepts, but that's how I use them in sort of my own informal composerly language. Michael Easter asks, what was the original name of the theme to the Classical Nerd channel? It's called Dance, number 2. It's a stupid title, but it was. I didn't come up with it. I'm not blaming my old composition professor came up with the title. I'm not blaming him for the fact that I think it's stupid. That there was a long time in my compositional career, like 2 years, but that's a long time for me because I'm quite young, where I didn't know the first thing about how to title pieces. And now I have more titles than I could ever hope to use. So how things change. Kinds for useful for my new book. Thank you for all your efforts. Oh, well, that is wonderful. Good luck on the book. Do composers no longer avoid parallel fifths as a rule? What are the trends in this regard? That is a very good question. I should probably devote an entire video to that. That was a very good question. Sometimes I use fifth freely. I never fully understood why fifths are avoided in common practice, harmony, and counterpoint, really. Okay, I should go into this. The reason that fifths were avoided was because it sounded like in 16th century counterpoint, it sounded like the notes were not separate. They used 2 consecutive fifths, then, not the notes, that the voices would not be separate and the notes would sound like one thing. Right? It was an elaboration of it. And the reason this is not super great is because they value the independence of lines and the independence of voices. And that those rules of counterpoint really became the rules of harmonic motion that were typical in, say, the voice leading of Bach. Like Bach really studied Palestrina. He knew his Renaissance counterpoint very well. And the rules of Baroque counterpoint were a little more free than the rules of Renaissance counterpoint. You would never have some of the stuff that Bach pulls in really most any of his masterpieces. The kind of chromaticism in for instance, the B minor fugue from the Well-Tempered Clavier. That's not something you'd ever get in the Renaissance era. But composers did avoid them because they had a very specific sound, and the entire point of avoiding perfect consonances, octaves and fifths in that way, is you didn't want it to just sound like one thing moving around, which is precisely why medieval composers so valued them when multiple voices started singing different things. They valued these perfect consonances, and then they thought the third, which is an imperfect consonance, was actually a dissonance, which is another interesting way to look at dissonance. But composers today usually don't avoid parallel fifths. But composers today are also working in very many different styles. So if you're writing a piece that's a little more traditional and you have a parallel fifth in it, it's going to sound like not in the right style. So these pieces, like if a parallel fifth cropped up in a piece that's a lot more contemporary, like parallel fifths in the Lament, I don't care. Like that, parallel fifths are totally part of that harmonic language. You don't want to overuse them, but there's a reason that Debussy was a French composer, right? He had all this music around him that didn't really care so much about the way voice leading worked, as opposed to how the Germans did. The Germans really did care about making sure you're avoiding parallel fifths. Can I see the 16th notes in the piano? Which 16th notes? Here? These are 16th notes, Evan. I hope that satisfies your craving. Question in regard to cello fifths. Recalling Beethoven's statement that the muse, difficulty performance, what if the composer is passionate about the part? That's another interesting question, and there's a question of like how much virtuosity is necessary for the expression of the piece. And for me, the question to ask myself whenever I'm doing something that's quite difficult is, do I really need this? Does this really need to be here? And in the case of those fifths, the lower note of that fifth isn't really going to give you anything, especially if you have the piano doing something at the same time. It's going to sound much better if you don't have it. It's going to sound more expressive. It's going to sound more like probably the way you'd want it to sound, as opposed to if you included the fifth, it would make it much more difficult. And the difficulty can be a part of performance practice. Like a lot of the new complexity stuff, Brian Ferneyhough especially is known for making his music extremely complicated for the sake of really making it extremely complicated. Like, that's just. But there's an aesthetic element to that as well, which is, he wants his performers to really dig deep into the music and confront the limits of their own abilities. This isn't like that, but it's somewhat similar in that, if you were calling for something that is sonically not as necessary, but yet you're still calling for it virtuosically, that does cast you as the composer in a very particular light of like, oh, I don't care what the performers think about this. This is what I need this note here. But if the note really doesn't make any sense there, or it's not adding anything, then why have it there? I mean, performers are only going to think more poorly of you. And I've always thought that, we as composers need to be nice to the performers, because they're the ones who get our music out there in the world. Reason there's two pianos. That is just an engraving error on the part of the composer. Trio for clarinet, cello, and fire alarm. Basically. How do you submit a piece for Masterclass? Just email me. There's no real length limit. If it's super long, I won't play all of it. I might just do a few movements here and there. What do you think of Sibelius' rotational form? I'm not super familiar with it. I was a little bit more when I did my script on Sibelius, but that was a while back. I really do think that Sibelius' music, especially his symphonies, have a really interesting and unique sound to them. I would say that has a large amount to do with the form. I will say Sibelius 2 is my favorite. But I don't know. There's a lot in Sibelius to unpack. But I think it was a running 16th notes up. The septuplets, Evan? Running 16ths up. It's probably in here somewhere. Hi Thomas, hope you've had a good day running a sonata for cello and piano for the first time. Piano keeps upstaging the cello. What advice do you have to prevent that? MIDI sometimes make it seem like the piano will take precedence, because in a performance, the cello, if it's a cello sonata, the cello you can play stuff that's quite low, and it will come to the foreground because the pianist knows their role as an accompanist, which is quite cool. And it's necessary if you're going to be an accompanist to understand the fact that you're in that role, and it's not just MIDI playback. So some of that might be the problem here, without looking at the piece, obviously, Kevin. What repertoire would you recommend analyzing or listening to? I think the Elliott Carter Cello Sonata is worth knowing. Mostly because Carter is he's a difficult composer. A lot of people don't like him to listen to. But his music is always very well structured, and he always based his music on the practicality of what the instruments could do and how they sounded. Right, the piano sonata is this full-throated, near-romantic, almost piece, and it uses a lot of resonance that pieces of that era were not using. Same with the cello sonata. I'm not as familiar with it as I am the piano sonata, but it is worth knowing, at the very least, just to know the piece, because it's one of the first big Carter pieces on the map, and it's not quite what he did later, to put it very mildly. But it is definitely worth knowing. I think if you're concerned about the piano upstaging the cello concerti, almost any one of them that you can name, are very good at that, in that you can look at even a piano reduction. You can see the kind of interplay. Of course, with an orchestra, it's much more difficult to keep the orchestra in the background because there's just so many instruments. But if you can use that as more of a model, and you can take a few more liberties because it's just the piano, you'll probably be fine. The piece is 15 minutes long. Sure, you can sit in. Oh, you're welcome, Ryan. Peter, how many pieces are in the queue right now? Currently 0. I just cover whatever pieces have been sent to me since the previous masterclass, which can be everyone between 1 and 13. This is a nice, good number here. I'd rather not do any more than like 4 or 5. Ryan says, I decided not to go use registration, seeing as I really thought the organist could better convey the piece depending on their instrument's disposition using dynamics. That's also true. When I did my organ piece, I did have a few expressive markings in there that helped the premiering organist. But she was also quite concerned that too many registrations would prevent the piece from being performed again. And it hasn't been performed again, mostly because it's extremely difficult to play. Miguel says, can you submit pieces that aren't recorded yet? Yeah, I do plenty of look at... most of the things I look at on this channel and these master classes are MIDI recordings. Different polish on rhythm notation. Yeah, rhythm notation is the biggest thing I always talk about here. When do you plan on doing another one of these? So I do one every 4 videos. So you can actually see going back on my channel, you can... It makes a nice little pattern. And I kind of like doing them every 4 videos or so, to keep things interesting. All right. Well, thank you all for hanging out and being here. And I need to eat dinner now. And I'm going to see if those fire alarms earlier were my roommate, which it wouldn't be the first time, and it definitely won't be the last. All right. Take care, everyone.